An economics professor lent $27 out of his own pocket to a group of struggling craftspeople in rural Bangladesh, and that single small loan eventually grew into a banking model that would go on to serve millions of the world's poorest people and win a Nobel Peace Prize. His name was Muhammad Yunus. In 1976, while teaching economics at Chittagong University, he visited a nearby village and met a group of women who made bamboo furniture, discovering they were trapped in a cycle where local moneylenders charged them extreme interest rates for the small amounts of capital they needed to buy raw materials, leaving them with almost no actual profit after repaying the loans. Traditional banks refused to lend to these women at all, considering the amounts too small to bother with and the borrowers too poor and lacking sufficient collateral to be creditworthy by conventional standards. Yunus personally lent the group a total of $27 from his own funds, and was struck by how reliably they repaid it and how meaningfully even that tiny amount improved their economic situation. Morgan Housel has written that some of the most significant financial innovations come from recognizing that an entire industry's standard risk assumptions might simply be wrong for a specific population that conventional finance had never seriously studied. Yunus's specific insight was that traditional banking's assumptions about creditworthiness, requiring collateral, formal credit history, and substantial loan sizes, excluded an enormous population of genuinely reliable borrowers simply because the existing system had never been designed with them in mind. In 1983, Yunus formally founded Grameen Bank, built specifically around providing small loans, known as microcredit, to poor individuals, with a particular focus on women in rural communities, who traditional banks would never have considered lending to. The bank operated without requiring traditional collateral, instead relying on small peer groups of borrowers who supported and held each other accountable for loan repayment. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized identifying genuine value that the broader market had overlooked or misjudged. Yunus applied a similar insight to an entirely different context, recognizing that the world's poorest borrowers, rather than representing unacceptable credit risk, actually repaid small loans at remarkably high rates once given fair access and reasonable terms, a genuine value the traditional banking system had simply never bothered measuring. Daniel Kahneman's research into how people evaluate risk based on limited, often biased information helps explain why traditional banks had overlooked this population for so long. Conventional lending models had been built around assumptions from wealthier, urban, formally documented borrowers, and simply extending those same assumptions to rural, poor populations without collateral produced an inaccurate picture of the actual risk involved, a gap Yunus's model was specifically designed to correct. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about access to capital being fundamental to building financial security applies here almost perfectly. Grameen Bank's entire model was built around the recognition that poverty often persists not because people lack the discipline or ability to build something productive, but because they lack any access whatsoever to the small amounts of capital needed to start. Grameen Bank grew dramatically over the following decades, eventually serving millions of borrowers across Bangladesh, with reported loan repayment rates that consistently exceeded those of many conventional banks, a result that directly challenged the assumption that lending to the poor was inherently too risky to be viable. In 2006, Yunus and Grameen Bank jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize, recognized specifically for using microcredit as a tool for reducing poverty and expanding economic opportunity. Here's an honest complication worth including. Since the broader microcredit movement Yunus pioneered has faced legitimate criticism and mixed results in various contexts since its initial success. Some researchers and economists have raised concerns about certain microfinance institutions charging excessive interest rates, about instances of aggressive loan collection practices in various countries, and about mixed evidence regarding how consistently microcredit actually lifts borrowers permanently out of poverty across different regions and contexts, as opposed to simply providing short-term relief. Yunus's own Grameen Bank has generally maintained a strong reputation, but the broader industry it inspired has produced results considerably more varied than its most optimistic early advocates initially predicted. George S. Classen's advice about the importance of access to capital as a foundation for building wealth applies directly here, though at a scale and context Classen himself never wrote about. Yunus's core insight, that even small amounts of accessible capital, provided under fair terms, can meaningfully change someone's economic trajectory, reflects a similar underlying principle, applied specifically to populations the traditional financial system had simply excluded from consideration. This isn't a simple story suggesting microcredit alone solves poverty, or that every microfinance institution that followed Eunice's model operated with the same integrity and effectiveness as Grameen Bank itself. What makes Eunice's story worth remembering is the specific insight at its center, recognizing that an entire population's genuine creditworthiness had been systematically misjudged, not because they were actually unreliable borrowers, but because nobody with the resources to lend had seriously bothered to look closely enough to find out. So here's a question worth sitting with. Is there a group of people in your own community or context who might be genuinely reliable, capable, or trustworthy in ways the broader system around them has simply never bothered to seriously measure? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated financially or professionally simply because you didn't fit the standard profile someone was screening for? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most validating stories on this channel come from people who eventually proved a system's assumptions about them completely wrong. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Muhammad Yunus didn't invent a new way to lend money. He simply proved that an entire industry had been measuring creditworthiness in a way that excluded millions of genuinely reliable people. A billionaire looked at his own company, worth roughly $3 billion, and decided the right thing to do wasn't to sell it, pass it to his children, or take it public. It was to give the entire thing away to fight climate change. His name was Yvon Chouinard, founder of Patagonia. Born in 1938, he started his business career as a rock climber making and selling handmade climbing equipment out of the back of his car in the 1950s and 1960s, gradually building that small operation into an outdoor clothing and gear company that would eventually become one of the most recognized and respected brands in the industry. From early in the company's history, Chouinard structured Patagonia around environmental values that went well beyond typical corporate messaging. The company famously ran an advertisement in 2011 explicitly telling customers, "Don't buy this jacket," encouraging people to think carefully about consumption and repair existing gear rather than purchasing new items unnecessarily, an unusual message for a company whose core business depended on selling clothing. Morgan Housel has written that a company's genuine values become most visible not in what it says in marketing materials, but in what it actually does when doing the right thing, according to those values conflicts directly with maximizing short-term profit. Patagonia's specific advertising campaign discouraging unnecessary purchases represented exactly that kind of costly, genuine signal, actively working against its own immediate sales in service of a broader environmental message it claimed to genuinely believe in. By 2022, at 83 years old, Chouinard made his most significant decision yet regarding the company's ownership structure. Rather than selling Patagonia to a larger corporation, taking it public through an IPO, or passing ownership directly to his children, he restructured the entire company's ownership so that all of Patagonia's voting stock went into a specially created trust focused on protecting the company's values, while all of the company's profits not reinvested into the business itself would flow to a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting climate change and protecting undeveloped land. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized understanding what a company is genuinely worth and how that value should be allocated. Chouinard's specific structural choice represented an unusual, explicit answer to that question, rather than converting the company's roughly $3 billion value into personal or family wealth. He directed the entirety of its ongoing profit generation toward a specific external cause he'd cared about throughout his life. Daniel Kahneman's research into how people typically prioritize their own family's financial security over more abstract causes helps illustrate just how unusual Chouinard's decision genuinely was. Most business founders who build something this valuable eventually pass ownership to their children or convert it into liquid, personally accessible wealth. Chouinard explicitly avoided both paths, stating publicly that he didn't want his children to inherit either the company or the associated financial burden of managing an enormous fortune they hadn't personally built. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about assets producing something meaningful applies here in an unusually direct, literal way. Chouinard didn't simply donate a portion of his existing wealth to charity once. He restructured the actual, ongoing income-generating mechanism of the entire company so that its future profits would permanently fund environmental causes, rather than accumulating as personal or family wealth indefinitely. Here's an honest complication worth including, since Chouinard's specific structure has drawn both praise and legitimate critical analysis since its announcement. Some analysts and commentators have noted that the specific trust and nonprofit structure Chouinard chose also carries meaningful tax advantages compared to alternative approaches, and that the arrangement, while genuinely redirecting substantial ongoing wealth toward environmental causes, doesn't function identically to Chouinard personally paying full, immediate taxes on an outright sale of the company. This doesn't necessarily diminish the genuine environmental commitment behind the decision, but it's worth understanding that even unusually generous financial structures often involve legitimate tax considerations alongside their stated charitable purpose. George S. Classen's advice about understanding exactly what money is genuinely for applies here at a scale and with a specificity Classen himself likely never imagined. Chouinard's entire approach reflects a specific, explicit answer to that question, that the company's ongoing value should serve a cause beyond his own family's financial security, structured permanently rather than as a one-time gift he could later reconsider. This isn't a simple story suggesting every successful founder should give away their entire company, or that Chouinard's specific structure is beyond legitimate scrutiny or debate. What makes his decision worth remembering is the specific, unusual clarity behind it, an explicit, structural choice to permanently redirect an enormous, ongoing source of wealth toward a cause outside his own family line, made deliberately rather than as an afterthought once his own needs and his children's needs had already been fully secured. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you built something worth billions of dollars, would you default toward securing your own family's wealth first, or would you seriously consider structuring it to serve something entirely outside your own bloodline? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Do you think a founder giving away an entire company to a cause, rather than to their own children, represents genuine generosity, or does it simply substitute one form of legacy for another? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most thoughtful disagreements on this channel come from people who see this exact question very differently. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Yvon Chouinard didn't just build a clothing company. He built a mechanism designed to keep generating money for a cause, long after his own name stopped being the one who decided where the profits went. One man, working essentially alone in a Singapore trading office, brought down a bank that had survived 233 years, financed the Napoleonic Wars, and served as banker to the British royal family. His name was Nick Leeson. Born in England in 1967, he began his career in the back-office settlements department of a major bank rather than as a trader, and eventually moved to Barings Bank, one of Britain's oldest and most prestigious financial institutions, where he was sent to Singapore in the early 1990s to help establish and manage the bank's futures trading operations in the region. Morgan Housel has written that some of the most catastrophic financial collapses happen specifically when the person taking the risk is also the person responsible for checking whether that risk is actually being managed properly, a conflict of oversight that, once it exists, tends to grow more dangerous the longer it goes unaddressed. Leeson's specific role at Barings created almost exactly that structural problem. He simultaneously ran the bank's Singapore trading desk and oversaw the settlement and accounting operations meant to independently verify what that same trading desk was actually doing. Beginning around 1992, Leeson started making unauthorized trades that generated losses, and rather than reporting these losses through the bank's normal channels, he used his unusual dual role to hide them in a secret internal account, informally referred to by insiders afterward as the 88/888 error account. He then continued trading aggressively, attempting to recover the hidden losses through increasingly large, increasingly risky bets on Japanese financial markets. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized rigorous, independent verification of a business's actual financial position, rather than trusting reported figures without proper oversight. Baring's internal structure represented an almost complete failure of exactly that principle. The bank's own internal controls failed to catch what should have been readily detectable irregularities, largely because the same person generating the trades was also responsible for the accounting meant to catch problems with them. Daniel Kahneman's research into how people respond to mounting losses helps explain the specific psychological trap Leeson fell into as his hidden losses grew. Rather than accepting an initial, containable loss and reporting it honestly, he repeatedly doubled down, taking on larger and more leveraged positions in an attempt to recover the growing hole before anyone discovered it, a pattern common to gambling losses generally, where the fear of admitting an initial mistake drives increasingly desperate attempts to erase it entirely rather than simply contain the damage. By early 1995, Leeson's unauthorized trading positions had grown to an enormous scale, heavily leveraged and increasingly exposed to Japanese stock market movements. When the Kobe earthquake struck in January 1995, triggering significant volatility in Japanese markets, Leeson's already massive, hidden positions moved sharply against him, generating losses that ultimately totaled roughly £850 million, an amount that exceeded the entire capital base of Baring's bank itself. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding exactly what risk an asset or position actually carries applies here at a genuinely catastrophic scale. Baring's own leadership, for years, appears to have believed Leeson's Singapore operation was generating consistent, reliable profits, without ever independently verifying the actual underlying trading activity generating those reported numbers, a gap between perceived and real risk that, once finally exposed, proved fatal to the entire institution. In February 1995, unable to continue hiding the scale of the losses, Leeson fled Singapore. Baring's bank, unable to absorb losses larger than its entire capital, collapsed within days and was eventually sold to a Dutch bank for a token sum, ending 233 years of independent operation. Leeson was later arrested, extradited, and sentenced to 6.5 years in a Singapore prison for fraud. Here's an honest complication worth including, since Leeson's story is sometimes told as though he acted with complete, calculated malice from the very beginning. Leeson himself has stated in later interviews and his own memoir that his initial unauthorized trade stemmed from covering a colleague's smaller error rather than from an original intent to defraud the bank, and that the situation escalated specifically because he found himself unable to admit the growing losses once the initial concealment began, a pattern that doesn't excuse the fraud, but does complicate a simple narrative of premeditated villainy from the outset. George S. Classen's advice about the danger of unchecked risk and the importance of genuine oversight applies here at an institutional scale Classen himself never anticipated. Baring's collapse illustrates, in the starkest possible terms, what happens when an organization allows the person taking risk to also be the person verifying that risk, a structural failure that made Leeson's specific deception possible, and arguably nearly inevitable, once it began. This isn't a simple story about one uniquely dishonest trader destroying an innocent bank through pure deception alone. Baring's own internal controls and oversight structure created the specific conditions that allowed a single trader's escalating losses to remain hidden for years, rather than being caught and contained early. What makes the story worth remembering is the specific structural lesson it illustrates. Even a 233-year-old institution can collapse within days once the person responsible for managing risk is also the person responsible for checking whether that risk is under control. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own life or work, is there a situation where you're essentially checking your own work, with nobody genuinely independent verifying whether things are actually going as well as you're reporting? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever hidden a small mistake, hoping to quietly fix it before anyone noticed, only to watch it grow into something much larger than it would have been if you'd simply reported it honestly from the start? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most honest confessions on this channel come from people willing to admit exactly how a small, hidden mistake eventually spiraled. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Barings Bank didn't survive 2 world wars only to be destroyed by a market crash. It was destroyed by one small, hidden mistake that nobody independent was ever positioned to catch in time.